Okay, it is 8:30 p.m. It is Tuesday, December 4th, and we are in week number 5 of Introduction to Criminal Law. I told you the quarter would go fast. Next week is it, and then we will be completing the whole quarter. So you want to make sure that a week from Friday is the 14th, and that's when the quarter ends. So you want to make sure that you get all your assignments in. Okay, remember at this point, I'll only accept assignments from week 4 on. So, which means that we're right at the point weeks 1 to 3. If you haven't gotten them in, I won't accept them unless I've made arrangements with you earlier to do that. So let's go ahead and get started and share my screen with you. Okay, and then you can see the information that you're familiar with. Again, reminding you about the lectures. The archives are all in here. So if you were going to if you missed a lecture, you can possibly do week 4, though it's pretty late if you do that now, because it was due on Sunday. But you can still get that in, and you'll lose some points. So now let's look at our week 5 assignments. Let's refresh that. Okay. So for the 5th week, crimes against moral values, we'll be discussing to prepare for this Chapter 7, a brief introduction of criminal law, the text. I've sent you the PowerPoint to help you. Also dealing with issues relating to drug laws, drunk and drug driving, distracted driving, hate crimes, and then you'll be able to practice with the key terms and drunk driving, forced draws, identify the drug schedule, and then your quiz. So this is a practice quiz. Remember, the next quiz will be next week, and that will be like a final. And then your discussion post, drunk driving, is due tonight, 11:59 p.m. Central Standard Time, and Saturday, 11:59 Central Standard Time. Finally, complete the written assignment. Has a hate crime been committed? And we'll go over that with the rubric. And then remember, we want to finish strong. So let's take a look at the calendar. So you can see where we are. You can see that we're wrapping up. We are in December. So we're at the week of the 3rd. Today's date tells you what your assignments are. Your reply post due the 8th. Then your written assignment is due on the 9th. Okay. And then we'll be back next Tuesday, the 11th, for the final lecture. Okay. And we'll discuss the issues there at that time. So let's go down and let's look at week 5 module. Again, let's look at the assignments. The discussion post. Then your written assignment has a part 2 in it. Actually, it's a 3-part. So you're going to write it from the police officer's perspective, defense attorney's perspective, and the detective's perspective. Each one should be at least 1 page. The total should be 3 pages. There should be citations and references. We've already been over that before. Then, and that's due, along with a cover sheet. And then your live lecture keyword that I'll be giving, you will be able to get that to get your points, your 5 points. Okay? So now let's go back to lessons content, where we'll finish up. Okay, crimes against moral values. Again, we'll talk about drug laws a little bit, drunk driving, distracted driving, and hate crimes. And then you'll be able to use these to practice quiz, identify the drug schedule, drunk driving, and forced drug draws, key terms. Okay, so let's get right to drug laws. As you should know, I teach a class, J150, drugs and crime, and where we go into details on these issues. But using drugs creates a moral problem because of the fact that it, first of all, adversely affects the individual who's using it, and that some people think that it shouldn't be legislated. Some people think that it should be legislated to protect irresponsible people. And personally, I agree that there needs to be some legislation, but there also needs to be some inclusion in dealing with drug laws to deal with the individuals who are hooked on drugs and to provide them with an opportunity to get help. And if they're able to get help, that will give them an ability to be able to decrease their criminal activity, because there is a correlation between drug use and crime. And that's because people commit crimes to support their drug habits. And it says there are no victims in the traditional sense when it comes to drug use, possession, or sale. I disagree with that because families are adversely affected as well. But the issue with drugs, as I talk about them all the time, is sometimes drug use starts out with an innocent prescription that becomes excessively used, and then the individuals, particularly painkillers, oxycodone, for example, and the individual then gets caught up in the use of the drugs. I do highly recommend the drug and crime course for more details about that. So in the enforcement of the use, possession, and sale of illegal drugs, there are laws, and it sets it out by schedule depending on the seriousness. They start out with, if you see high potential in Schedule 1 and 2 for abuse, no medical use in Schedule 1, and some examples are heroin, LSD, ecstasy, and marijuana. Now, be aware that that marijuana issue is obviously changing because there are medical uses for marijuana, and many jurisdictions are passing laws to legalize the use. California, one of the earlier states was Colorado, I believe Massachusetts, and there is some discussion here in Illinois about legalizing marijuana. And so, but the big issue with these drugs is a lot of times, particularly marijuana, is what it's laced with. And there are things that are included in there that create problems. Then there's a Schedule 2 drug, which does have uses, but there's some issues of dependence. Oxycodone, I mentioned that earlier, fentanyl, leading to opium and cocaine. And again, it's like I said, it can start out with a painkiller where an individual will then graduate all the way up to cocaine and heroin as well. Schedule 3, lower potential for abuse, may lead to psychological issues, such as abusing Tylenol with codeine, Suboxone, ketamine, anabolic steroids, those kind of things. And you'll notice that the higher the schedule, the less there is a how should I say abuse issue, but may lead to limited physical Schedule 4 psychological uh, Xanax and Valium, and all these basically get to a point where people use them or overuse them. Excuse me. Excuse me. And then Schedule 5 drugs, the least potential for physical, psychological. Usually there's cough syrups, something with codeine in it, but people abuse those as well. And so there are statutes throughout the United States. Now, what came about in the 80s was a form of cocaine that was real cheap called crack cocaine. And as it says here, it was primarily cocaine, or it says here 80% cocaine. And it was a very cheap drug. And what happened is that many gangs and other organizations illegally started distributing this cheap high, and it actually increased the war on drugs because there were shootings that took place, and so and it led to what the Reagan administration did in the 1980s with the war on drugs, and the war on drugs is actually something that I tell people is not working because it's based on incarceration. And the key thing is that you need to get help for people so that those who use drugs will decrease. Therefore, if there's no individuals who are customers, then it will go away. But that's a long shot, and that's something that we need to work on. Then it talks about here what I talked about earlier. States such as Colorado have legalized the use of marijuana. And so the thing is, though, that the federal laws still outlaw marijuana. So the point of the matter is that there is some issues as to, as I said, about Schedule 1 designation, and some people think it should be a Schedule 2 or even maybe a 3. The Uniform Controlled Substance Act requires states to create laws relating to possession, sale, and delivery. Now, the thing with possession, depending on the quantity, if it's a lower quantity, it's quite often believed that individuals who end up in what we call drug court, which I represented many people in during my years as a lawyer, and one of the main things that we would do with those individuals is plead them guilty unless there's a technicality in terms of violation of the Fourth Amendment or something like that. Then we would recommend those individuals go and get some help. And one of the conditions of usually what we get was supervision or probation, and those individuals are then required to attend drug treatment. And not very many completed it, but the key thing is that we want to try to operate to help individuals. So that's you can find more information in this link, which I won't take time to go into. So then we talk about the possession of controlled substances from the perspective of the criminal law. So there's what we call actual possession, where the person has it under control, such as in their pockets or in their immediate control. Then there's constructive possession, which occurs, for example, if it's a person who has the control, a pipe or something, it's more of an automobile thing. The key thing is that many jurisdictions with actual possession actually have more serious than constructive possession. And you can see in the state of Ohio that there are statutes that talk about knowingly. That means that person was aware they had it, a controlled substance, or a controlled substance analog. This is a substance that is Schedule 1 or 2 or similar, such as designer drugs, spice, and these are actually made in labs, or should I say chemicals that make those drugs. So the key thing is that what we're talking about is that those individuals in many jurisdictions face crimes because of the fact that they are taking drugs and they're mixing them and they're providing a more lethal drug. And so you find people arrested for, as it says, delivering a controlled substance that has 1,000 grams or more of a Schedule 1 or 2 narcotic. And so if the amount of controlled substance is between 45 grams but less than 1,000, then the sentence is not more than 30 years imprisonment. In addition to the quantity of drugs possessed, if the person has a digital scale with them, or such baggies that they use to put the drugs in, and these determine possession. So it's the items that you have along with the drugs that makes it more, because it shows that you are a manufacturer and you are what we are, hardcore distributor. And then you'll see the various states. So it says at the bottom line, and this is where I'm going to leave it, controlled substances not only put the individual user at risk of long-term addiction and self-harm, but it puts us all at risk because the individual will get behind the wheel of a car, or, as I already said, it will allow individuals or cause individuals to commit crimes to support their habits. Thus, we have an increase in the crime rate. So dealing with drunk driving, you can, or drug driving, that is that you're high on drugs, whether there's prescription drugs or not. The key thing and issue in alcohol, it's going to be based upon a percentage of blood alcohol. But there are many people who die every year relating to drunk driving and drug driving. When I was practicing, the blood content level was 0.10. Now it's 0.08. Then you're considered to be driving under influence, even if you think you can control a vehicle. And it has decreased individuals in drunk driving. But all states have the following elements. If you operate or driving a motor vehicle upon a highway, roadway, parking lot, or driveway accessible to the public while impaired by alcohol. Now, you are in physical control of a vehicle if you are under the influence and, look, you're in the driver's position of the front seat or in the driver's position of a streetcar or trackless trolley, and you have possession of the vehicle's streetcar ignition key or other device. So here's the deal. What if your car is running and you are sitting on the driver's side? Are you responsible or can be held liable for driving under influence? The answer is yes. What if the car is not running and the key is in your hand or in ignition and you're driving and you're under the influence? The answer is yes again. So it is a very serious thing. And that driving under the influence of DUIs kill people quite frequently, And the burden is on the prosecution to establish 3 points. First, that a vehicle was operated, and then the person was under the influence of drug or alcohol with a blood alcohol content of 0.08, or if the driver is considered impaired, caused the death of another. Okay. It is important to note that specific intent is not an element in drunk driving. The mere operation of a motor vehicle on a highway, driveway, while impaired is prohibited. Notice, even if you're sitting in your driveway, a parking lot, the same thing. I've seen situations where people sitting in an open field and the same thing above happens where you have considered impaired. And so some examples of people who are driving under influence, you've seen them. They might be weaving, go through a traffic signal, striking a curb, those kinds of things. Physical appearance, the odor of intoxicants, red or bloodshot eyes, slurred speech, and then it talks about police administer 3 validated field sobriety tests and things that they can have you to do. And horizontal gaze, walk and turn, one leg stand, those kinds of things. So there's all kinds of things that can be done in addition to the breathalyzer. If you drive a vehicle and you refuse to take the breathalyzer or breath test, all states have what we call implied consent laws, which means arrested impaired drivers, if they decide not to take the test, their licenses are generally suspended, and the penalties could be increased, because what you do is you eliminate or minimize the burden of the prosecution to prove that a person is driving under the influence. And so if you read the case of Missouri versus McNeely, a 2013 case, you'll see more details concerning that. Drug driving, I already explained that to you, under the influence of drugs. And, a lot of times this happens where an individual is high, but sometimes they don't know because they inadvertently took a medication. But if you pay attention to most medications, there usually is a warning for driving. So you can take time. This is a half-an-hour video that tells you more about driving while drugged. Distracted driving, we get into this where people are texting, people are doing all kinds of things, they're talking, and so many jurisdictions now require hands-free devices when people are driving their vehicles. And it talks about teen driving, because teens they're the earliest drivers. You should be aware that their insurance rates are higher. And so the point of the matter is that they want to minimize it. They have some jurisdictions are working toward even eliminating handheld devices, because I can tell you the truth. There are times when a person can be engaged in a hands-free device and distracted from what's taking place on the road. So talks about here in Illinois, penalties for violating this law is increased if a driver is involved in a crash that results in great bodily harm, disability, or disfigurement, or death to another. And so it's a very serious offense. So distracted driving, compared with drunk and drug driving, is a problem that we'll continue to battle. And unfortunately, people are still injured because people drive under these situations. Let's conclude here by talking about hate crimes. So what is a hate crime? What is a hate crime? A hate crime is a crime that would ordinarily be maybe possibly a misdemeanor, but could be elevated to a felony because of the fact that the crime is related to the individual's race, sex, national origin, or disability. So it could be a case where a person makes it clear that they did it because of that person's race, because of that person's sex, because of their sexual preference, because the person is disabled. And so hate crimes came about in 1968 when the federal hate crime statute in Chapter 18 of the United States Code, which is the chapter for all criminal laws on the federal level. And it says it made it a crime to use or threaten to use force against a person because of race, color, religion, or national origin. And now hate crimes have been extended to include additional classes such as sexual orientation, gender, or disability. And so, and after that, many states, most states, have hate crime laws. And again, it says here the intent of hate crime laws is to prevent criminals from intentionally selecting the classes that I mentioned of people and committing crimes of them, such as battery, robbery, vandalism, or arson. And then this talks about the example of a hate crime in a jurisdiction in Wisconsin. Okay. So the key thing to remember in hate crime is that the crime is committed because of that person's status, their sex, their race, their sexual preference, national origin, or things of that nature. Okay? Now, you want to study these key terms again. I'm just going to touch on it. I'm not going to stay on it long. You use the flashcards, and remember, run the Adobe Flash, allow it. Once you do it, it'll stay in for the other assignments as well. It says it occurs in incidents where a person has the right or ability to control the item, but it's not on their person. So you flip the card and you see the answer. Constructive possession. We talked about that earlier. A substance that is substantially similar to the chemical structure of a Schedule 1 or 2, such as a designer drug, K2 or spice, which is substantially similar to marijuana and therefore a controlled substance. So that's a controlled substance analog because it's mixed. And then you go next to the next one. Okay. So that's how you study those. But I've gone over those many times, and I do recommend that you use them because they help you prepare for the quizzes. And it helps you prepare for the final that will be coming up next week as well. Okay. And then same thing for practice driving and blood draws. You click on it, and then practice identifying the drug schedule, and you'll learn how to know that. And then your practice quiz, which I've already told you over and over to use that. And so with that, I'm going to conclude this session, and I'm going to give you a key phrase. And the key phrase that I'm going to give you relates to something that is very, very, very important, and that's DUI. DUI. Or you can write driving under influence, but DUI is what I will be looking for. Okay, and get your assignments completed according to what I said. And with that, I'm going to say good night.